In the early 2000s, on the west side of Cleveland, 3 young women vanished one after another while walking along familiar streets they had traveled their entire lives. Each disappearance occurred in daylight or early evening, in places considered safe, creating a contradiction that neither investigators nor families could reconcile. How could 3 individuals disappear so quietly, so completely, within such a small radius? Michelle Knight, the eldest of the 3, carried herself with the quiet determination of someone who had entered adulthood earlier than expected. At 21, she was small, soft-spoken, and consistently focused on practical responsibilities. Her schedule revolved around a custody matter involving her young son, a difficult process that required her to travel frequently between relatives' homes and county offices. She kept to herself, rarely discussing her worries, and held tightly to the hope that the upcoming court date would move her closer to rebuilding her family. On the afternoon of August 23, 2002, she left a cousin's house intending to reach that appointment. The walk was short, familiar, and uneventful. No neighbor reported anything unusual, and Michelle did not express concern to anyone she passed. Yet she never arrived at the courthouse. By evening, her absence could no longer be explained by delays or misunderstandings. Several months later, a different kind of routine guided 16-year-old Amanda Berry through her days. Amanda balanced high school with a part-time job at a nearby fast food restaurant, often calling home between shifts to keep her family updated. Her 17th birthday was approaching, and she talked openly about her plans for the coming year. On April 21, 2003, just after 8 o'clock in the evening, she phoned her sister from work and said she had arranged a ride home. It was a short call, one that carried no urgency or sign of concern. When she failed to return by nightfall, her family retraced her usual path and contacted friends, but no one had seen her after she left the restaurant. By the following spring, the pattern would repeat a third time. 14-year-old Gina DeJesus, well-liked at her middle school and known for her lively, easygoing nature, typically walked home with friends along Lorraine Avenue. On April 2, 2004, she followed that same routine after classes. She and her closest friend stopped to use a payphone, calling to request permission for a sleepover. When the request was denied, the girls parted ways as they had many afternoons before. Gina continued her walk alone. Somewhere between that payphone and the next intersection, she vanished without a witness able to describe what occurred. In each case, the final moments were so ordinary that nothing initially signaled danger. A short walk to a courthouse, a ride home after work, a routine path from school. Families expected the young women to return by evening, only to realize within hours that something had broken sharply from the expected pattern. Calls went unanswered, local searches revealed nothing, and the streets that usually carried their footsteps gave no indication of where they might have gone. What tied the disappearances together, though no one recognized it yet, was proximity. 3 young women vanished from neighboring areas of the same side of the city over a span of less than 2 years, all while doing things they had done countless times before. The familiar setting that once seemed safe offered no insight, only silence. And from those final ordinary moments onward, none of them were seen again. When Michelle Knight failed to arrive at her scheduled court appointment on August 23, 2002, the absence was initially interpreted through the lens of the challenges she had been facing. Investigators later noted that the first 24 hours of her case passed without a formal missing person classification. Relatives attempted to contact her, traveling between homes she frequented and speaking with neighbors who had seen her earlier that day. No one reported signs of distress or hurried movement. The streets she often walked remained busy with afternoon traffic, offering no space where a disturbance might have gone unnoticed. Because Michelle was an adult and had previously moved between temporary living arrangements, Her disappearance was not immediately escalated to a high-priority alert. In the days that followed, the local precinct opened an initial inquiry. Officers documented her last confirmed movements, interviewed relatives involved in the custody process, and reviewed potential destinations she might have chosen if she wished to distance herself temporarily. The notes preserved from those early interviews reflect uncertainty rather than suspicion. No witness recalled unusual activity on her route, and no personal belongings were recovered that could indicate her direction of travel. With no evidence of a struggle, no recorded sightings, and no financial activity traced to her identity, the file was set aside without closure, waiting for information that never surfaced. By the time Amanda Berry vanished 8 months later, the city's memory of Michelle's case had faded. On the night of April 21, 2003, Amanda's family reacted immediately when she failed to return home. Her sister replayed the short phone call they had shared only hours earlier, noting that Amanda's voice carried none of the tension one might expect from a person sensing danger. At the precinct, officers documented the timeline beginning with the end of her work shift. The fast food restaurant confirmed she had left at her usual hour, and her co-workers provided consistent accounts of her last interactions. Surveillance in the area offered limited coverage, and the stretch of road between the restaurant and her home contained no cameras capable of capturing foot or vehicle traffic with clarity. The search for Amanda expanded more rapidly than the one for Michelle, in part due to her age and the absence of personal conflict that might suggest voluntary departure. Detectives canvassed nearby businesses, collected statements regarding unfamiliar vehicles, and reviewed call records from the phone used to contact her family. Within a week, the case shifted from a routine missing person entry to one that required assistance from federal agencies. Volunteers distributed flyers throughout Lorraine Avenue and the surrounding neighborhoods, and local media carried daily reports urging anyone with information to come forward. The investigation then encountered a turning point. An unidentified male used Amanda's phone to contact her mother. The call, brief and vague, offered only the claim that Amanda was fine. The statement was unsubstantiated and provided no verifiable detail, yet it altered the direction of the inquiry. Detectives considered the possibility that she had left voluntarily, though those closest to her insisted such behavior would be inconsistent with her character. With no additional communication from the caller and no traceable signal leading to a specific location, the investigation returned to a state defined by uncertainty. When Gina DeJesus went missing on April 2, 2004, the repetition of the pattern began to trouble investigators. 2 disappearances of teenage girls within a 1-mile radius had already prompted community concern. A third case, involving a 14-year-old who vanished in daylight while walking home, intensified public attention. The last person to see Gina, her friend Arlene, provided a clear timeline to officers. Their conversation at the payphone was documented, and the route Gina usually followed was mapped in detail. Despite the clarity of those final moments, no witness recalled observing a vehicle stopping near her, no pedestrians reported unusual behavior, and no physical evidence was recovered along her path. The joint task force formed after Gina's disappearance reviewed the 3 cases side by side. Investigators observed similarities in the locations. All 3 young women vanished within a narrow corridor of Cleveland's west side, near bus lines, shops, and residential blocks where movement was steady throughout the day. Yet the disappearances lacked any clear connection beyond geographic proximity. No common acquaintance appeared in interviews, no shared workplace or school, no pattern in timing that might suggest an organized approach. Without a suspect or a defined method, the inquiry remained reactive rather than strategic. Families across the neighborhood held walkthroughs, prayer gatherings, and community meetings. Law enforcement released composite sketches and reopened previous tips, sifting through reports of unfamiliar individuals seen near schools or public payphones. The volume of information increased, but the quality of leads remained limited. Officers noted that the disappearances occurred without sound, without witnesses able to describe a confrontation, and without the discovery of items indicating forced removal. The absence of indicators left investigators without a starting point from which to build momentum. During the second year of Gina's case, the task force began exploring whether the disappearances might be unrelated, despite surface similarities. Analysts reviewed criminal activity in surrounding counties, cross-referenced registered offenders, and examined cases from other states involving young women who had vanished under comparable circumstances. None of those efforts produced evidence that could align with the details of the Cleveland cases. Meanwhile, the families continued their individual searches, speaking regularly with investigators and appearing in local broadcasts to keep the cases active in public memory. Although the three files remained open, each began to settle into a phase investigators refer to as extended pending, the period when immediate leads are exhausted but the case cannot be closed. The lack of conflict in the victims' personal lives, the absence of credible sightings, and the sudden nature of each disappearance made the situation particularly difficult to interpret. Detectives documented in their notes that the environment in which all three girls vanished was too familiar, too ordinary, and too populated for three separate disappearances to occur without someone noticing a change in routine. Yet nothing emerged. As the months turned to years, the three families preserved the details of their daughter's last known movements, waiting for evidence that might finally clarify what happened within those narrow stretches of road. As the months passed without progress, each of the three disappearances gradually entered a quieter, more complicated stage of investigation. Detectives who had initially worked the cases full-time rotated to other assignments, and the files transitioned into the category reserved for incidents with no active leads, but too many unanswered questions to close. For the families, this period did not bring relief or resolution. It simply reshaped the uncertainty into something more enduring. For Michelle Knight's relatives, the difficulty of the early search had left a lasting impact. Because she was an adult at the time of her disappearance and had been experiencing instability in her living situation, initial assumptions had led investigators to believe that she might have chosen to leave temporarily. When weeks turned into months, the lack of clear direction caused her case to slip into near silence. Detectives revisited her file periodically, checking for activity tied to her identification or any change in her personal records. None appeared. The absence of official updates meant that with each passing year, fewer people beyond her immediate family remembered the day she vanished. Amanda Berry's disappearance remained more publicly visible. Her family kept her story in circulation through interviews, vigils, and community gatherings. Her mother, Luana, carried a folder of notes to every meeting with investigators, documenting calls, tips, and even the most remote possibilities. Each time authorities contacted her, she asked the same questions. Had anyone used Amanda's phone again? Had a witness finally stepped forward? Had new technology offered a detail that was unavailable in 2003? The answers remained unchanged. But unlike Michelle's case, Amanda's file received outside attention through national broadcasts, which periodically revived public interest even when the investigation itself was stalled. During these years, detectives continued to re-examine the man who had placed the brief call from Amanda's phone. The tone of the call was catalogued, the exact language preserved in reports, and analysts attempted to match it with previously recorded voices. Without additional data, however, the call remained a fragment, too vague to build on, too significant to ignore. As each year passed, the moment gained weight in the file, a reminder of a trail that existed but did not lead anywhere. Gina DeJesus's case retained a strong presence in the community as well. Her parents organized annual walks along the route she had taken on the day she disappeared, inviting residents, students, and local officials to join. The events served both as reminders and as silent appeals for new information. Though investigators attended some of these gatherings, they typically did so without updates to share. The case remained open, but the flow of actionable information had long since dried up. Behind the scenes, detectives periodically revisited all 3 cases as a group, searching for a link that had been overlooked. Analysts reviewed maps of the neighborhoods, studying the distances between the last known points of contact. Although the disappearances took place in the same general area, none of the files contained evidence connecting the victims directly. Their routines were different, their ages varied, and their personal circles did not intersect. The only clear similarity was the geographic boundary, and even that was too broad to serve as a defining marker. Between 2004 and 2010, Cleveland experienced several unrelated incidents that briefly drew attention away from older cases. Each time a new missing person report emerged, the families of Michelle, Amanda, and Gina contacted investigators, hoping that the new information would intersect with their daughter's files. In most instances, detectives reassured them that the new reports were separate and would not influence the status of the earlier disappearances. The search continued to gain small, unpredictable sparks of energy from the public. Volunteers placed flyers at bus stops, grocery stores, and churches. Retail workers often kept the posters near their registers. From time to time, an individual claimed to have seen someone resembling one of the girls. These sightings were recorded, evaluated, and, in most cases, eliminated within days. Travel records, security footage, and interviews consistently contradicted the claims. Though the search extended across state lines on several occasions, none of the leads established a verifiable connection to the missing women. As the cold years progressed, the psychological weight increased for the families. They lived in a state of suspended motion, maintaining hope while navigating the reality that extended disappearances rarely return answers. A parent's vigil at the kitchen table, a sibling who kept an unchanging bedroom, a holiday season observed but incomplete. These details shaped the environment surrounding each case more deeply than any formal report. Investigators, too, experienced the strain of unanswered questions. Some officers involved in the early stages retired or transferred to other divisions, leaving their notes for the next generation of detectives. Those who remained revisited the files during annual case reviews, comparing old information with new databases, reevaluating statements from past witnesses, and looking again at interviews that had previously seemed routine. Nothing emerged that could break the silence surrounding the disappearances. Despite years of limited movement, one element remained consistent: community interest in seeing the cases resolved. Annual events continued, media outlets occasionally revived coverage, and national programs occasionally mentioned the disappearances in segments related to missing person investigations. Even with minimal evidence, the memory of the 3 young women persisted in public awareness. By 2012, nearly a decade had passed since Michelle vanished, and 8 years had passed since Gina's disappearance. For many outside the families, the cases appeared destined to remain unsolved. Yet those closest to the young women believed that answers still existed somewhere. They held on to the idea that a single detail, a forgotten observation, a new technological tool, or an updated analysis, could shift the direction of the investigation. Throughout this period, none of the 3 families allowed the cases to fade from their daily lives. They continued filing updates with investigators, organizing walks, attending community meetings, and marking anniversaries. Each action served both as an act of remembrance and as an affirmation that, despite the passing years, the story was not yet finished. The neighborhood where the disappearances occurred changed as time moved forward. New families moved in, businesses opened and closed, and students who had once been the same age as the missing girls grew into adults. Yet the routes they once walked and the corners where they were last seen remained unchanged in the memories of those who had searched for them. The unresolved nature of the cases left a quiet imprint on the area, a reminder that even familiar streets can hold unanswered questions. By the beginning of 2013, the three files remained active but stagnant. Nothing indicated that a breakthrough was imminent. Nothing suggested that the missing women were near, or alive, or reachable. Yet the investigations remained open, and the families continued to wait. They had no way of knowing that the truth was far closer than anyone had allowed themselves to imagine. By early 2013, the investigations into the disappearances of Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus had reached a point where any new progress felt unlikely. The case files had grown thick with years of interviews, tips, and procedural notes. Yet none of those details had pointed investigators toward a definitive lead. What ultimately shifted the course of the investigation did not arise from a new witness, a technological breakthrough, or a re-examined piece of evidence. Instead, it emerged from a moment that, at first glance, appeared unrelated to the long-standing missing persons cases. On the afternoon of May 6, 2013, uniformed officers received a 911 call from a residential neighborhood several blocks south of the original disappearance sites. The caller identified herself as Amanda Berry, an announcement that, if true, would change the trajectory of 3 cold cases instantly. The dispatcher, uncertain whether the call was legitimate, documented the location, the tone of the caller, and the urgency in her voice. The address provided, 2207 Seymour Avenue, was an ordinary 2-story home in an older section of the city, known more for its long-standing residents than for transient movement. When the first officers arrived at the scene, they observed a small crowd forming near the front porch. Neighbors pointed toward the house, repeating that a young woman had emerged asking for help. The officers moved cautiously, aware that misidentification or confusion is common in cases involving long-missing persons. The front door showed signs of damage consistent with a recent attempt to force it open manually. They entered with measured steps, announcing their presence clearly before proceeding further inside. On the interior staircase, they encountered a woman who identified herself again as Amanda Berry. Records later confirmed that her physical appearance matched archived photographs, though changed by years that had passed since her disappearance. After verifying essential information, the officers escorted her and a small child outside to medical personnel waiting nearby. What followed inside the house reshaped the investigation entirely. As officers continued down the hallway, they encountered another woman. Frightened, cautious, but responsive, she confirmed her identity as Michelle Knight. A moment later, Gina DeJesus stepped into view from a separate room. The home that had appeared externally unremarkable was revealed to be the location investigators had been searching for across more than a decade. The discovery did not occur through surveillance or targeted search patterns, but through an unexpected opportunity seized by one of the victims. That fact, recorded plainly in the investigative summary, marked the case as one of the rare instances in which a cold investigation was resolved through self-initiative rather than procedural breakthrough. In the hours immediately following the discovery, the focus of the investigation shifted from search to recovery and assessment. Medical staff conducted preliminary evaluations, noting exhaustion, nutritional deficiency, and prolonged environmental deprivation. Investigators documented the layout of the residence, photographing each room and carefully recording structural modifications that appeared inconsistent with standard residential design. Windows had been boarded from the inside, interior doors had been reinforced with multiple locking mechanisms, and areas of the house were sectioned in ways that suggested long-term confinement rather than typical use. Outside the home, detectives coordinated with additional units to locate the primary occupant of the property, a man later identified as Ariel Castro. His name, previously unknown to the investigative teams managing the disappearances, did not appear in the early case files as a person of interest. When officers located him in a parking lot approximately several blocks from the residence, he was taken into custody without resistance. The arrest added a new dimension to the investigation, shifting attention toward evaluating whether this individual could be definitively connected to each disappearance. At the command center, the initial debriefing with the recovered women provided essential information about the timeline of their captivity. Investigators noted that each woman identified the same location as the place she had been held and provided consistent details regarding the conditions within the home. These details aligned with the structural observations taken by officers during the first sweep of the residence. The consistency of the accounts allowed investigators to construct a preliminary timeline corresponding to the dates each young woman had vanished. The most significant breakthrough came not from a new piece of forensic evidence, but from the survivor accounts themselves, which confirmed their identities and provided explanations for their absence extending back to the early 2000s. For investigators who had spent years searching for information without results, the clarity of these statements marked a turning point. It provided confirmation that the cases had not been separate incidents, but were linked to a single location and a single individual. As documentation continued, analysts reviewed the geographical relationship between the home on Seymour Avenue and the last known locations of each disappearance. The distances were short enough that the proximity alone, had it been known earlier, might have influenced earlier canvassing patterns. Yet nothing in the early investigations had pointed toward the home or its occupant. No disturbance had been reported by neighbors in a way that prompted follow-up. Patrol officers had visited the residence once in connection with a separate issue, but had found no cause for further inquiry. In the days following the discovery, the investigation expanded to include a full forensic examination of the property. Environmental technicians documented evidence of prolonged, controlled seclusion. Forensic specialists cataloged items within the residence that may have been connected to the victims. Structural specialists analyzed alterations to the layout, noting the reinforcement of interior doors and the restricted access to certain rooms. Meanwhile, interviews with neighbors revealed a range of observations. Some reported seeing the homeowner occasionally accompanied by a child. Others recalled hearing noises at odd hours, but assumed they were connected to routine activity. A few had attended vigils for the missing girls, unaware that their neighbor, living only houses away, was connected to the very cases discussed at those gatherings. As investigators pieced together the information, the three previously separate disappearances converged into a single narrative. It became clear that the answers sought for more than a decade had been contained within the walls of one residence, hidden by routine, assumption, and the absence of direct evidence. The break in the case had not come from technological improvement, a new witness, or the opening of an old lead. It had come from a moment of opportunity inside a place where opportunities had been systematically denied for years. The cold years ended not with discovery by authorities, but with action taken by those who had survived them. In the days immediately following the rescue of the three women from the house on Seymour Avenue, investigators began assembling the broader timeline of events by comparing survivor statements, physical evidence, and the suspect's own recorded history. For more than a decade, the disappearances had appeared unrelated, scattered across different neighborhoods, and separated by months or years. The interviews conducted in the aftermath, however, revealed a continuity that investigators had never been able to identify through traditional inquiry. Central to this stage of the investigation was determining how the abductions had been carried out, whether the suspect had acted alone, and why the residence had remained inconspicuous for so long. Analysts reviewed the structure of the property room by room, documenting the ways in which the environment had been altered to restrict movement and visibility. The internal reinforcements, multiple locks arranged in a sequence, boarded windows sealed from the inside, and sections of the house made inaccessible to visitors, suggested that the modifications had been installed gradually over time. None appeared to have been added in haste. Instead, they reflected planning and confidence that the changes would not draw attention. When investigators compared these observations with survivor testimony, a clearer picture began to form. Each woman described being approached in familiar settings, offered transportation by someone they recognized from the neighborhood or surrounding community. The absence of forceful confrontation in public spaces explained why no witnesses had reported disturbances and why no immediate connection had been drawn between the disappearances. Once inside the residence, movement had been restricted through a combination of locked rooms and physical barriers. Over the years, small shifts in the layout had been made to accommodate changing circumstances, but the overarching structure remained centered on isolation. Reviewing the suspect's background provided further context. Records indicated that the man had lived in the neighborhood for decades, holding consistent employment for many years and maintaining family ties that gave him a familiar presence in the area. Interviews with neighbors painted a portrait of someone who moved quietly, avoided conflict, and maintained predictable daily routines. Many remembered seeing him driving to and from work, attending community gatherings, or performing small tasks outside his home. These routine behaviors contributed to the perception that he posed no reason for concern. Detectives also examined earlier interactions between police and the residents. A review of call logs showed that officers had visited the home once for an unrelated issue, but found nothing during that contact that prompted suspicion. In a neighborhood where many houses showed signs of wear or had areas closed off for personal storage, the internal conditions of one residence did not stand out as an anomaly. The architecture of the area, combined with the privacy afforded by single-family homes, made it possible for controlled isolation to remain undetected. As investigators continued collecting information, survivor testimony added a crucial dimension that no forensic evaluation could provide. The women described years marked by restricted movement, limited contact with the outside world, and a carefully maintained environment designed to prevent detection. The accounts were detailed but consistent, outlining both the layout of the residence and the long intervals during which outside activity was minimal. They described only rare moments in which the suspect interacted with neighbors, visits that were brief and controlled. Throughout this stage of the inquiry, one question remained central. How had 3 disappearances, all within a small radius, all linked to routines familiar to the victims, remained unsolved for so long? Investigators revisited the case files preserved from the earlier years, noting details that, in hindsight, appeared closer to one another than previously understood. When viewed across the span of more than a decade, the Sheba pattern looked clearer, yet each disappearance at the time had been interpreted through its own set of circumstances. With the suspect now in custody, investigators conducted extensive interviews to determine whether he acknowledged involvement in the abductions. The statements he provided offered limited insight. He described his actions using language that minimized responsibility and attempted to frame the events in ways inconsistent with the accounts provided by the women. Analysts reviewing the interviews noted moments in which he attempted to shift blame or reinterpret the circumstances. None of those efforts altered the course of the investigation, as the physical evidence within the residence and the consistent testimony from the women provided confirmation sufficient to proceed. To build a complete timeline, investigators constructed a detailed chronological map tracing the dates of each disappearance, the modifications observed in the residence, and the statements describing changes over time. The resulting timeline provided a clear indication that the residence had been used consistently as a place of confinement for more than a decade. The evidence supported the conclusion that the suspect had acted alone, making use of the structure of the house and his position within the community to avoid detection. In the following weeks, law enforcement officials prepared the case for formal charges. Prosecutors reviewed every available document, from the earliest missing person reports to the most recent recovery notes, to determine how each count should be structured. The number of charges increased as investigators continued identifying specific acts across the timeline. The legal team prepared a comprehensive indictment reflecting the duration of the disappearances and the circumstances documented after the rescue. When the case entered the judicial stage, observers noted that the volume of evidence, the length of the timeline, and the clarity of survivor testimony left little room for ambiguity. Attorneys on both sides evaluated the likelihood of a trial, yet the consistency of the documentation created an environment in which the outcome appeared straightforward from a procedural standpoint. For investigators who had spent years revisiting the files, the emerging picture brought clarity, but also a sense of weight. The proximity of the residence to the original disappearance sites, and the length of time during which the victims had been kept out of sight, yet close to home, transformed the cases from isolated incidents into a single narrative of long-term concealment. The realization that answers had existed within a residential block familiar to many in the community added a difficult dimension to the investigation. By the time the key elements of the truth had been assembled, the central questions that had remained unanswered for more than 10 years began to resolve. The disappearances were connected. The missing women were alive. The location had been found. And the individual responsible was in custody. The long-standing mystery that had lingered across Cleveland's west side now stood fully exposed, revealing that the most significant break in the investigation had come not from external discovery, but from the moment the victims themselves created their own escape. In the weeks following the rescue, the legal process moved quickly. What had once been 3 separate missing person cases now formed a single, extensive criminal file. Prosecutors began reviewing the accumulated documentation. Years of investigative notes, the structural findings from the residence, statements from the 3 women, medical evaluations, and supplemental reports from officers who had entered the home on Seymour Avenue. The scope of the case was unlike anything the local court system had handled in recent memory, not because of a single extraordinary incident, but because of the continuity of events spanning more than a decade. The preliminary hearings served primarily to formalize the transition from investigation to prosecution. When the suspect was brought into the courtroom for the first time, observers noted his quiet demeanor and limited outward reaction to the charges read aloud. Prosecutors emphasized the length of the timeline, the number of counts under consideration, and the need for the court to evaluate the full span of documented conduct rather than viewing the incidents as isolated acts. The indictment continued to expand as additional details were confirmed, eventually numbering in the hundreds. From the outset, the legal strategy of the prosecution centered on clarity and structure. Each count reflected a verified segment of the timeline, supported by testimony or physical evidence from the residents. The nature of the documentation meant that the case did not rely on ambiguous interpretation, but on a record that had been corroborated through multiple channels. Analysts reconstructed the interior layout of the home based on photographs, diagrams, and the statements provided by the women, creating a visual record that would be admissible in court if required. While the prosecution prepared its case, defense attorneys evaluated the options available. Their client faced a volume of charges so substantial that any traditional trial would require months of testimony, extensive cross-examination, and the potential re-traumatization of the women who had already provided detailed accounts. Discussions between the defense and prosecution reflected an awareness that the impact of a full trial would extend beyond legal procedure into personal and psychological dimensions for the survivors. During this period, the court ordered a comprehensive psychological evaluation of the suspect. This examination aimed to determine whether he was capable of understanding the proceedings and assisting in his defense. The results confirmed that he met the legal standards for competency. With competency established, the prosecution intensified its preparations, readying the documentation for presentation before a jury should negotiations fail. Meanwhile, the survivors continued their recovery process under the guidance of medical teams and support specialists. Prosecutors maintained close communication with them, ensuring they remained informed about the progress of the legal case without requiring them to attend procedural hearings unnecessarily. Their well-being remained central to the court's approach. Officials emphasized that the legal system's responsibility extended beyond punishment to the protection of those who had endured the events under investigation. By late July 2013, discussions between both legal teams produced a significant development. The defendant agreed to a plea arrangement that required him to acknowledge responsibility for hundreds of charges in exchange for removing the possibility of a prolonged trial. The agreement ensured that the hearings would not require the women to recount their experiences in open court, and it provided a definitive resolution. The defendant would serve life in prison without eligibility for parole, plus additional years intended to reflect the full scope of the case. During the plea hearing, the courtroom remained silent as each charge was read aloud and acknowledged. Journalists present noted the contrast between the gravity of the charges and the composure displayed by the judge, who maintained a steady, unemotional tone throughout the proceedings. Once the plea had been formally accepted, the court set a date for sentencing. The sentencing hearing drew substantial attention from both local and national observers. Prosecutors presented an overview of their findings, summarizing the timeline of the disappearances, the conditions confirmed inside the residence, and the statements provided by the survivors. They emphasized that the plea agreement did not reduce the severity of the charges, but merely consolidated the legal process to avoid unnecessary harm to those affected. When the time came for the survivors to speak, the courtroom shifted from procedural order to something more personal. Each woman addressed the court in her own way, not for the purpose of influencing punishment, since the sentence was already established, but to articulate the significance of reaching this moment. Their statements reflected the durability of their spirits rather than the weight of the years they had lost. They spoke not with anger, but with clarity, each reinforcing the truth that they had survived what many believed impossible. After the statements concluded, the judge delivered the formal sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus 1,000 additional years. The structure of the sentence ensured that no future legal challenge could alter the duration of confinement. The judge noted that the sentence reflected not only the duration of the events, but also the profound harm caused to the survivors and the community. As the defendant was escorted from the courtroom, the legal phase of the case came to its conclusion. The plea, the sentence, and the acknowledgement of responsibility created a final resolution that had been unimaginable during the long years when the women were still missing. For investigators who had remained committed to the cases despite limited progress, the hearing represented an endpoint to a search that had lasted more than a decade. For the families, it marked the closure of a chapter defined by fear, uncertainty, and unanswered questions. In the immediate aftermath, the legal system turned its attention to ensuring long-term support for the survivors. Community organizations, charitable groups, and counseling services expanded their involvement. Public donations formed structured funds dedicated to recovery, education, and future independence. The conclusion of the court proceedings did not erase the years that had passed, but it established a foundation upon which the survivors could rebuild their lives with autonomy and safety. By the end of the summer of 2013, the judicial portion of the case had fully closed. The man responsible was permanently removed from society, and for the first time since 2002, the three names that had once appeared only on missing person posters now appeared in documents confirming their return. The courtroom's final act did more than assign punishment. It affirmed that the truth, kept hidden for more than a decade, had finally come to light. In the months following the sentencing, the three survivors began shaping new lives separate from the long period they had endured. Their return marked the end of one journey, but introduced another. One defined not by the circumstances of their disappearance, but by the choices now available to them. Medical teams, counselors, and support organizations worked in coordination to ensure that each woman had access to long-term resources. Yet it was their own resilience that ultimately guided the direction of their recovery. Michelle Knight, the eldest of the three, approached her new beginning with a clarity shaped by years of isolation and self-preservation. She changed her name. A decision made not to erase the past, but to define a future in which she would no longer be viewed solely through the lens of the events she had survived. She spoke publicly only when she chose to, describing her recovery as a personal path rather than a public process. In interviews, she acknowledged the years that had been taken from her, but she also expressed determination to build a life centered on stability and purpose. Her interest in culinary arts grew into a plan to open a small restaurant, a space she envisioned as both a workplace and a personal milestone. Although she understood that reconnecting with her son would require careful consideration, she expressed hope that one day, when he reached adulthood, they might meet under circumstances of mutual choice rather than emotional pressure. Amanda Berry entered the next phase of her life with additional responsibilities. As the only survivor who had left the residence with a child, she faced the dual task of establishing stability for herself and creating an environment in which her daughter could grow up without the weight of the past shaping her identity. Community support played a significant role. Local organizations assisted with housing, education, and structured financial resources. Amanda later began working in broadcast media, using her role to highlight missing person cases in the region. Her decision to focus on helping others reflected both her lived experience and her recognition of the importance of community awareness. In this work, she provided families with the visibility that she herself had once depended upon, creating a tangible connection between her past and her present. Gina DeJesus re-entered her community at an age when many of her peers were completing school or planning adult careers. Her family, long anchored by hope, welcomed her home with a steadiness that gave structure to her recovery. She participated in local efforts aimed at improving missing child response systems, including collaborations with organizations dedicated to public safety. Her involvement in the Amber Alert Committee allowed her to engage with families facing uncertainties similar to those her own family had endured. Despite her youth at the time of disappearance, Gina approached these tasks with a calm maturity that reflected both her experience and her commitment to ensuring stronger protections for others. For the community, the aftermath required its own kind of adjustment. The discovery that the three women had been held within a residential neighborhood for more than a decade prompted reflection about the nature of awareness, assumptions, and vigilance. The house on Seymour Avenue, once central to the case, was demolished as part of the legal agreement. The removal of the structure signified more than the clearing of a physical location. It represented an acknowledgement that healing required reshaping the environment itself. In its place, a small memorial space and garden were established. A quiet area intended not to dwell on the past, but to honor resilience and provide a space for reflection. Law enforcement agencies across the region conducted internal reviews to improve procedures for missing person investigations. Policies were updated to strengthen coordination between departments, enhance follow-up on community tips, and adjust criteria for alerts in cases involving young adults. Training programs were revised to address the complexities associated with cases that show few outward signs of disruption. The 3 disappearances, once considered isolated, became instructional examples for future investigations, shaping guidelines meant to prevent prolonged uncertainty in similar cases. The families of the survivors adjusted gradually to the new reality. Years of searching had created patterns of vigilance that did not disappear overnight. Some habits, like leaving porch lights on or keeping phone lines open late into the night, remained long after the women returned. These behaviors reflected not fear, but an acknowledgement of how deeply the years of absence had shaped family rhythms. Over time, however, those patterns softened as daily life took new form. Beyond the immediate families, the city itself held a complex emotional response. Relief, gratitude, and disbelief intertwined with lingering questions about how the events had remained hidden for so long. Community members expressed a renewed awareness of the importance of noticing small changes in routine, listening to instincts, and checking on neighbors. Programs focused on community safety gained increased participation, and local organizations experienced a rise in volunteers dedicated to supporting vulnerable groups. Public interest in the case remained strong for several years, yet the survivors gradually reduced their exposure, choosing privacy over continuous reminders of the past. When they did appear publicly, they framed their presence through messages of empowerment, emphasizing growth and forward movement. Their voices carried a tone not defined by the events themselves, but by the strength required to rebuild. In the broader legal landscape, the case influenced discussions about sentencing, supervision, and community-level prevention. Professionals in criminal psychology, victim support, and investigative procedure referenced the timeline as a study in both vulnerability and resilience. It became an example of how cases can remain unsolved, not due to neglect, but because circumstances allow concealment to occur in ways that defy typical investigative patterns. By the time a decade had passed since their rescue, the 3 survivors remained connected not by shared trauma, but by mutual respect. Their paths diverged as each pursued a life defined by individual choices: family, education, advocacy, stability. Occasionally, they spoke at the same events, offering insight into recovery and the importance of long-term support. Yet their day-to-day lives were intentionally private, shaped not by public expectation, but by personal healing. The final chapter of this story is not one of closure in the traditional sense. The years lost cannot be restored, and the impact of the disappearances continues to echo through family histories, investigative archives, and community memory. But the years after their rescue demonstrate something beyond resolution: the ability of individuals and communities to rebuild, reshape, and redefine themselves after prolonged uncertainty. Their return did not erase the past, but it allowed something equally significant: the chance to create a future. If this reconstruction helped you understand the case more clearly, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing for more. Long-form investigations told in a calm, factual voice. Tell me where you're watching from and which case you want explored next. Your suggestions guide the direction of future stories.